He didn't know what I did for a living. That was the first mistake he made, and in the end, it was the only one that mattered. My brother has always thought of me as the family afterthought, the one who showed up at Thanksgiving and sat in the corner, the one who never talked about work, never dropped impressive names, never had stories worth telling at the dinner table. My stepbrother Marcus thought I was a glorified data entry clerk. My dad thought I was doing okay, I guess. My stepmother thought I was wasting my potential. The only person who ever asked me real questions was my grandmother, and she passed 3 years ago. So when everything fell apart last spring, nobody in that house saw it coming. Least of all him. My name is Gwen. I'm 31 years old, and for the last 6 years, I've worked as a forensic accountant for a federal contractor that I'm not going to name here. What I can tell you is that my job is to find money that people don't want found, hidden accounts, shell companies, fraudulent transfers dressed up as legitimate expenses. I look at numbers the way a surgeon looks at an x-ray. Every shadow means something. Every gap is a story. I'm good at what I do. Very good. But at family dinners, I said I worked in finance. That was enough to make everyone's eyes glaze over. And that was exactly the point. My dad remarried when I was 14. His new wife? I'll call her Carol because that's her name and she's earned every letter of it. Came with a son 2 years older than me. His name was Kevin. Kevin who lettered in lacrosse. Kevin who went to a state school on a partial scholarship and somehow turned that into a personality. Kevin who at 33 had never held a job for longer than 18 months but always had an explanation ready that made it sound like the company's loss. Dad adored him. Carol adored him. They had built an entire mythology around Kevin, the almost professional athlete, the entrepreneur who was between ventures, the charming one who could work any room. I was the quiet one, the one with the spreadsheets. We didn't hate each other, Kevin and I. For a long time, it was more like mutual indifference, with a thin layer of politeness stretched over it. He didn't ask about my life. I didn't ask about his. We passed the green beans. We watched the game. We went home. That changed 14 months ago, when my dad had a minor stroke. It wasn't severe. He was in the hospital for 4 days, came home with some new medications and a list of lifestyle changes he immediately ignored. But it scared all of us, and it changed the house in ways that took a while to show themselves. The biggest change was that Carol started talking about the future. What would happen to the house? What would happen to Dad's retirement accounts? What would happen to the small landscaping business he'd owned for 22 years? The one he'd built from a single truck and a hand-painted sign into something that employed 11 people and turned a real profit. Dad had always said the business would go to both of us equally, Kevin and me, 50-50. I had never particularly wanted it. I had my own career, my own savings, my own apartment, 40 minutes away. But it was the principle. It was what he'd promised. Within 2 months of Dad coming home from the hospital, Kevin had appointed himself the de facto manager of Hartley Landscaping. He started showing up at the office, talking to the employees, signing things. Dad let him because Dad was tired and Carol encouraged it and it was easier to say yes. I watched it happen from a distance. I drove out on Sundays. I had dinner. I asked my dad how he was feeling. I did not make a scene, but I started paying attention. The thing about financial fraud is that it almost never starts with a dramatic decision. Nobody wakes up one morning and says, "Today I'm going to steal." It starts smaller. A reimbursement that's a little too large, an expense that's a little too vague, a vendor invoice from a company you've never heard of that happens to share an address with someone's cousin. I noticed the first irregularity in August. I wasn't even looking for it. I'd offered to help Dad organize some paperwork for his accountant. Just a favor. Just a Sunday afternoon. And there it was, sitting in a manila folder like it wasn't anything. A payment of $4,200 to a company called Ridgeline Property Solutions for site consultation services. I knew every vendor Dad used. He'd talked about them my whole life. Ridgeline Property Solutions was not one of them. I didn't say anything that day. I took a photo of the invoice with my phone and I drove home. That night, I ran the company name through every database I had access to. Ridgeline Property Solutions LLC had been registered in Delaware 4 months earlier. Its registered agent was a name I didn't recognize, but the mailing address for correspondence, a P.O. box in our county, had been used in 2 other business registrations. One of them was a holding company tied to Kevin's college roommate. I sat with that for a long time. I need to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I think people expect me to say I was angry. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was something colder, a kind of clarity, like when you've been staring at a blurry image and suddenly the resolution sharpens and you can see exactly what you're looking at. I'd spent 6 years finding exactly this kind of pattern in corporate accounts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I knew how it worked. I knew how it grew. Small invoices at first, just under the threshold that triggers automatic review. Fictional vendors with real-sounding names, gradual escalation as confidence builds. Kevin had been doing this for at least 4 months, possibly longer. I did not confront him. I did not call my dad. I went back to what I know. I documented everything. Over the next 3 months, I built a file. I did it carefully, methodically, the same way I would build a case for a federal audit. I cross-referenced every payment, every vendor, every timeline. I found 6 shell companies in total, all registered within 18 months of Dad's stroke. Ridgeline Property Solutions, Summit Resource Group, Piedmont Equipment Rentals. That one was almost funny because Dad's business didn't rent equipment, they owned it outright. Total amount diverted, somewhere between $67,000 and $74,000, depending on how you categorize the ambiguous ones. He had also, and this part took my breath away when I found it, begun the process of filing paperwork that would restructure the business's ownership. He hadn't completed it, but the draft documents existed buried in a folder on the business's shared drive that he apparently forgot I had access to. If he'd finished it, he would have moved himself into a majority position and diluted my share to something functionally meaningless. I printed everything. I backed it up in 3 separate locations. I organized it into a binder that a first-year associate attorney could follow without any help from me. And then I waited because I had learned a long time ago that timing is everything. The confrontation, I didn't plan it. I want to be clear about that. It was a Saturday in November. I'd driven out to have lunch with my dad, something we've been doing most weekends. Carol was out. Kevin was supposedly at the business, doing whatever it was he told my dad he was doing there. Dad and I were sitting at the kitchen table and he was telling me, in that careful voice he uses when he's trying to make something sound smaller than it is, that he'd been thinking about making Kevin a co-owner of the business. Formally. On paper. He looked at me while he said it like he was waiting for me to argue. And I could see it in his face. He'd been coached. He'd been prepared for pushback. Carol and Kevin had sat with him and prepared him for the conversation and told him what to say. I didn't argue. I asked him if I could use the bathroom, and he said of course, and I walked to my car and got the binder. I set it on the kitchen table while he was still holding his coffee cup. Before you sign anything, I said, I need you to look at this. I thought about this moment many times. I'd imagined he might get defensive. I'd imagined he might not understand it. What I hadn't imagined was how small he would look, sitting there, turning pages. My dad built that business with his hands. He drove the truck himself for the first 3 years. He missed things, school plays, a few birthdays, one graduation, because he was working, and he had watched Kevin walk in and start helping himself. He went very quiet. That's the thing about my dad. He doesn't explode. He goes quiet in a way that fills up the whole room. How long have you known? He said. 3 months. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because I needed to be sure, and because I needed it to be something you couldn't argue with. He nodded. He turned another page. There's more, I said. He started filing paperwork to restructure ownership. He didn't finish it, but he started. My dad put the binder down and looked out the window at the backyard, at the garden my grandmother had planted 20 years ago, and I watched him understand something that I think part of him had been avoiding for a long time. Kevin wasn't between ventures. Kevin was stealing from him. What happened next moved faster than I expected and slower than I wanted, which is how these things usually go. My dad called his attorney that afternoon. Not Kevin, not Carol. His attorney, a man named Mr. Duttard. Delaney, who'd handled Dad's legal affairs for 15 years and who, when he heard a summary of what I'd found, told my dad not to sign anything and not to discuss the business with Kevin until they'd spoken in depth. Carol came home at 4 o'clock and walked into a very different house than the one she'd left. I won't pretend that conversation was pleasant. She accused me of jealousy. She said I'd always resented Kevin. She said I'd manipulated data. She actually used that phrase, manipulated data. And I thought, Carol, you have no idea who you're talking to. I didn't raise my voice. I had the binder. I had the documentation. I had, at that point, already sent copies to my own attorney and to an encrypted backup that existed entirely outside of any system Kevin or Carol could access. Kevin came home at 6. He walked in on a scene he clearly hadn't been prepared for. His mother crying, my dad sitting at the table with a stack of papers, me sitting across from him. He looked at me. And I saw it, that flicker, the one that told me he'd known this was possible. He'd known someone might find it eventually. He just hadn't thought it would be me. Gwen, he said, like my name was a question. Kevin, I said, you should probably call a lawyer. He tried several things in the following weeks. That's the part people don't always tell you about. The aftermath is messy and unglamorous, and it takes time. He tried to claim the payments were legitimate, that Ridgeline and the other companies were real vendors for real services. His attorney sent a letter. My attorney sent a response with supporting documentation that was 47 pages long. He tried to get to my dad directly, called him 4 times in 1 week. My dad, to his credit, stopped answering. Carol tried to get me to sit down with them for a family conversation. I told her that if she wanted to have a conversation, she was welcome to have her attorney call my attorney. The thing Kevin didn't understand, couldn't have understood, because he thought of me as the quiet one with the spreadsheets, was that I had been doing this professionally for 6 years. I had helped build cases that sent people to federal prison. I knew how people behave when they're cornered. I knew every move before he made it. In February, Kevin was formally removed from any role at Hartley Landscaping. The business attorney filed the paperwork. Dad changed the authorized signatories on every account. In March, Dad filed a civil complaint against Kevin for conversion and breach of fiduciary duty. His attorney had also referred the matter to the county district attorney's office, and I had provided a complete copy of my documentation to the DA's investigator. As of the filing, the amount Kevin had fraudulently diverted was confirmed at $71,400. Kevin moved out of Carol's house, Dad's house, in April. He went to stay with his college roommate, the same one connected to the shell company. I don't know what their conversations look like. I don't want to know. My dad called me on a Tuesday morning in April, a day I was working from home. He said he wanted to tell me something before I heard it from anyone else. The DA's office had decided to pursue charges. Felony theft, possibly more, depending on how the investigation developed. He said it quietly, the way he says everything that matters. And then he said, I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. I had rehearsed a version of this conversation in my head, a version where I said the right thing, something gracious and clean. What actually came out was, Dad, you were sick. He waited until you were sick. There was a long pause. I know, he said. He made a calculated decision. That's not on you. Another pause. You protected it, the business. You protected it, the business. You protected what I built. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said, that's what you do for family. I meant it to come out sharp. It didn't. It came out like I meant it. Carol is still married to my dad. That's the part of the story that people find hardest to understand. He's 63 years old. He had a stroke. He loves her, or he loves the version of their life that existed before all of this, and I'm not sure he can tell the difference anymore. She hasn't apologized to me. I don't expect her to. Some people are constitutionally incapable of that particular motion. What she has done is stop telling my dad that I manipulated data. Kevin's case is still working through the court system. These things take time. I have given my deposition. I have handed over every document requested. I have been calm and precise and thorough, because that is the only way I know how to do anything. The business is doing fine. Better than fine. Dad brought in a real operations manager in January, A woman named Patrice, who has 20 years of experience and immediately reorganized the scheduling system and increased efficiency by something like 18%. I like her a lot. I still drive out on Sundays. Dad and I have lunch. Sometimes it's just us. Sometimes Carol is there, and we talk carefully around the things we don't talk about. It's not perfect. It's not the family I would have designed if I'd been given a choice. But he's my dad, and he built something real, and I was not going to let someone take it from him while I was standing close enough to stop it. People ask me, when I tell this story, which isn't often, whether I feel bad about it. Whether it bothers me that Kevin is my family? Sort of. Technically. By the particular accident of my dad falling in love with the wrong woman 20 years ago. The honest answer is no. Not because I'm cold, I don't think I'm cold. But I have spent 6 years watching what financial fraud does to people. I've seen retirement accounts emptied. I've seen small businesses destroyed. I've seen people lose things they built over decades because someone they trusted decided their needs mattered more. Kevin made a decision. He looked at my dad, his stepfather, a man who had given him a roof and a last name and more benefit of the doubt than he'd ever earned, and he decided that his own wants were more important than all of that. He did it quietly, methodically, over months, because he thought he was the smart one. He thought I was the one with the spreadsheets. He was right about that. He just didn't understand what it meant. There's something I haven't told you yet. When I found the first invoice, Ridgeline Property Solutions, August, $4,200, I called my supervisor the next morning. Not to report it, not officially, not yet. Just to talk through what I was seeing with someone I trusted. She listened, she asked a few questions, and then she said something I've been thinking about ever since. She said, the hardest audits are always the ones where you already know the answer before you find the proof. Because the whole time you're gathering evidence, you're also grieving. She was right. I was grieving. I was grieving the family I had wanted us to be. The stepbrother who could have been, I don't know, a real one. The version of my dad's second marriage that could have made him happy without costing the rest of us something. I grieved all of it, quietly, on Sunday evenings while I was cross-referencing shell company registrations and organizing documents into labeled folders. I did the work anyway. Because grief doesn't change what's true. It just makes you more careful with it. The last thing I want to tell you is about a Sunday 3 weeks ago. I drove out to have lunch with my dad. It was a warm day for March and he'd opened the back door to let some air in. We ate sandwiches at the kitchen table and talked about Patrice and about one of the long-time employees who was thinking of retiring and about whether Dad should try to get more sleep. Before I left, he walked me out to my car. He does this sometimes. It's a thing he's always done, walked people to their cars, stood in the driveway until they drove away. I used to think it was just habit. He hugged me by the driver's side door and held on for a second longer than usual. Then he stepped back and looked at me the way he looked at me when I was little. Before the stroke, before the second marriage, before everything got complicated. You know what I keep thinking about, he said. What? You never once panicked. Through all of it, you knew what to do. I thought about telling him the truth, that I panicked plenty, just never in front of him, that there were nights I sat at my kitchen table at midnight questioning everything, wondering if I was wrong, wondering if I was missing something, wondering if I was about to blow up what was left of our family for nothing. But I looked at him standing in his driveway, 63 years old, tired in the particular way of someone who has learned a hard thing late, and I decided that what he needed to hear was something simpler. I learned from you, I said. You always figure out what needs to be done and you do it. He laughed. A real one, small and surprised. I drove home. The business is still standing. My dad is still standing. So am I. I've thought a lot about what made Kevin think he could get away with it. And honestly, I don't think it was stupidity. He's not a stupid person. What it was, and I've seen this pattern more times than I can count in my work, was a particular kind of arrogance that comes from never having been caught. Every time he got away with something small, he took it as permission to go bigger. The lacrosse scholarship that wasn't quite what he claimed, the business venture that quietly dissolved with other people's money. Each one taught him the same lesson. Nobody checks. Nobody digs. Nobody is paying close enough attention. He was wrong about that. He was just wrong about the specific person who was paying attention. That's the thing about choices. They don't announce themselves as permanent. Kevin didn't sit down one day and decide to become someone who steals from his sick stepfather. He made one small decision, and then another, and then another. And by the time the pattern was visible, it was already $71,400 deep. That's how it always works. Not a single dramatic fall, but a long, gradual slope that feels like flat ground until you look back and realize how far down you've gone. I think about Patrice sometimes, the operations manager Dad hired after everything happened, and how she walked into that business and within weeks had reorganized systems that Kevin had been managing for months. She brought order where he had brought chaos dressed up as competence. The contrast was so clean it almost made me laugh. The right person in the right role doesn't need to steal anything. They just show up and do the work. That's the part I keep coming back to. Competence is quiet. It doesn't announce itself at dinner tables or demand recognition. It just builds things carefully over time. And the things it builds last. Kevin needed everyone to believe he was valuable because he couldn't produce anything that proved it. I didn't need anyone to believe anything about me. I had 6 years of documented work and a 47-page response letter that said everything I needed to say. My dad asked me once if I felt guilty. Not about turning Kevin in. He knew the answer to that, but about waiting 3 months before I told him. About sitting across from him at Sunday lunches while I was building the case in the background. I told him the truth. I said that if I had told him the moment I found the first invoice, Kevin's attorney would have had time to obscure things, to move money, to construct alternative explanations. The 3 months I spent documenting weren't about withholding from my dad. They were about making sure that when I handed him the truth, it was a truth that couldn't be argued with. That's what patience actually is, I think. Not waiting passively, not hoping things resolve themselves. It's working steadily toward a moment when the evidence is undeniable and the timing is right, even when every instinct is screaming at you to act right now. My supervisor told me that the hardest audits are the ones where you already know the answer before you find the proof. She was right. But I'd add something to that. The hardest part isn't the grief, though the grief is real. The hardest part is staying precise when you're grieving, staying methodical, not letting emotion collapse your process. I stayed precise. The business is still standing. My dad called it protection. I call it just doing what needed to be done.